From Babylon's Fall to Avengers, Square Enix has had a number of failures in recent years, and it kind of has everyone wondering when they're really going to get it together in terms of consistent quality releases. Well, just recently, we've had Jacob Novick, who is a former director of business at Square Enix, and recently he's come out to talk about what he thinks about Square Enix's business operations, and I find this incredibly fascinating. So please be sure to hit that subscribe button because today we got a really fascinating topic here about the successes and failures of Square Enix. Here is what Jacob has had to say. I was quoted in Stephen Totillo's excellent Axios newsletter today. I want to reinforce my strong disagreement with the position taken by analysts and quoted by former staff in this month's business piece on Square Enix. For those who aren't aware, there's been a number of analysts who have been very doom and gloom on Square Enix, and Jacob here quite thoroughly disagrees with the take that a lot of these analysts have been having. He then continues saying, to start, as a reminder, I reported directly to two Square Enix Holding CEOs, Yoichi Wada and Yosuke Matsuda, for the better part of a decade, and I ran a subsidiary for them. The notion that the producers' fiefdoms are an issue is laughable, and I'm puzzled by which employees and contractors spoke to that would give this position. The company's successes are thanks to their producers. It is an auteur-driven company. This means that Square Enix lives and dies on their successes. But I would argue that the opposite. Committee-driven game products is worse. Nintendo's successes are credited to Miyamoto or Aonuma, Fortnite to Donald Muster, etc. Games should be driven by producer visions. Yes, Square Enix has had several games that were poorly reviewed. Indeed, they have. Sometimes, you have to take a swing at a new IP, and you miss. To try to not make new IP is worse, and all we get is sequels. We should laud them for trying. What is the correlation between previous titles failing to sell and Final Fantasy XVI sales? None, he says. There is no fan that said that Babylon's Fall was poorly reviewed. I guess I won't buy Final Fantasy XVI because of that. This is nonsense logic. It is not how brands work in games. People don't skip Activision's Call of Duty because the publisher made a bad Skylanders game. However, it may impact your enthusiasm and your willingness to go and buy Final Fantasy XVII if you felt like, oh, well, Final Fantasy XVI really didn't do it for me or wasn't the game that I was expecting, especially if you have, sort of multiple of those instances in a row. So I do agree that, yeah, it's not like anyone looked at Babylon's Fall or Forspoken and said, yeah, I'm not going to buy Final Fantasy XVI or Rebirth is out with me. Yeah, definitely no one is saying that. However, I do think that there are definitely some people who are like, yeah, the past few Final Fantasies may not have done it for me, so I'm not going to buy the next Final Fantasy. And I do think that is somewhat of an issue that they do have to some extent, where there are definitely some people out there who just feel like there hasn't been, the types of Final Fantasies that they want for a really long time. And maybe there is some attrition there. He then continues saying, an analyst in the piece was quoted as saying Square Enix flooded the market. This is also false. The publisher released a handful of titles in the last year. Babylon's Fall was from 2022, Forspoken in 2023, and Avengers from 2020, and wasn't even developed by Square Enix Japan, meaning that the argument on organization structures here is not relevant. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy XVI's Metacritic is an 87, FF7R's Metacritic is an 87. Quality bar is consistent with a game also hailed as a success, and both are higher than 15, which was an 81, and also considered a success. Yeah, I mean, no matter how you may personally feel about any of these Final Fantasy games, to suggest that any of them were a tremendous financial failure has just not been true. I think we've only ever had one mainline Final Fantasy title that was a financial failure, and it's now the most profitable Final Fantasy game of all time, and that is Final Fantasy XIV. So there really has never been a mainline title that they didn't make any money or they lost really any money. And the review scores for most mainline titles have been good, even if they are in somewhat of a decline compared to the 90s that a lot of the titles used to get. He then says, I was flabbergasted by the takes here. The sales problem, and note that Kiryu himself has said that sales were in line with expectations, is very clear. Platform exclusivity in 2023 is harming more than it helps. So God, here comes the console warriors. PlayStation has a huge lineup of titles, and many upcoming, highly anticipated first-party titles. They are great titles, of which the FF series is now one of the many high-quality titles that Sony promotes. This is why Kiryu's first decision was to bring back Xbox support. Let's be clear. I am not suggesting Xbox sales by themselves can radically change the numbers. We know how the series has sold on Xbox traditionally. Rather, the point is that you need multiple platforms promoting, pushing your product, and incentivizing toward its success. An FF title having its latest gameplay reveal in another state of play doesn't expand the audience, but Xbox putting out billboards for your title in Times Square can drive more awareness, even if it leads to sales on PlayStation rather than Xbox. This is still good for Square Enix. This is something that I think is really fascinating. Kiryu's definitely bringing back the Xbox support, right? There's no reason that Final Fantasy XIV couldn't have came to Xbox at a sooner point. However, it seems like Square has had their business relationship with Sony, and they ended up never porting the game to Xbox. And now 14 is coming, and it also makes you wonder, with some of the exclusivity contracts expiring for games like FF7 Remake Part 1, if those games are eventually going to come to Xbox, especially with Kiryu, the new president, promoting Xbox and trying to make Square Enix multi-platform again. I think he also makes a really fascinating point, and something that I really hadn't considered to quite the extent until he pointed it out. And that's that it isn't so much that these games are going to sell tremendously on Xbox, because as he said, traditionally, you go and look at the Xbox sales for games like Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy XV, they're not huge. It's not like it's making this, massive dent from them not being on the platforms, especially with them being cut an exclusivity check from Sony. However, what is making the big difference here is that you're going to have Microsoft promoting your game, and you're going to have Sony promoting your game. And so you have more dollars going into your marketing that is going to raise awareness on the game and get more people buying it. And I actually think in that light, he makes a fantastic point. And of course, it's not like there won't be any sales on Xbox. I'm sure that, if you release any of these games on Xbox, they could probably do $500,000 to $1 million at least. Even though most of the audience is currently on PlayStation, I'm willing to bet there are some people there who will buy these games on Xbox. Again, not a tremendous number, but enough for it to have paid for itself versus taking the exclusivity check. Now, you replied to some of the tweets, and these are really fascinating, so I want to read some of these. Mr. Guy here with the lovely username has had this to say. Also, Final Fantasy VII Remake has a very strong nostalgia on its side. It's a remake of the most popular FF game ever made. 16 didn't have that. It also has quite a different design system than the other modern FF games, which are of course very consistent with the turn-based ones. And Jacob replied to this by saying, sales for the two titles are similar, Metacritic similar, yet analysts depress Square Enix stock price. This is because FF16 sales expectations were higher than FF7R sales expectations. The only solution is to improve your sales and distribution methods. Now, this is actually really fascinating. This is because FF16 sales expectations were higher than FF7R sales expectations. I actually find that really insane, because again, Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy XVI have done pretty similarly. I know that fans feel very differently about these two titles, but if you go and look at the Metacritic scores, both are at roughly the same Metacritic score. And if you look at the sales, Final Fantasy VII Remake sold 3.5 million, and that was on 110 million PS4s in its first week. And then Final Fantasy XVI has sold 3 million, and that was on 40 million PS5s at launch. So these are pretty similar numbers that we're dealing with. This isn't like a drastic disparity. These are games that kind of put out at about the same output. Again, regardless of how one may personally like one game or the other. However, if you look at the journalist spin on the game, they've definitely picked Final Fantasy XVI as the sort of failure game, and they didn't really have that same energy when it came to Final Fantasy VII Remake, despite the games, again, both performing about the same in terms of sales, in terms of Metacritic. If we're talking about objective metrics, they have performed about the same. He then replies to this again, I get that, but sales expectations realistic? FF7R released on PS4 with a bigger install base than 16 did with PS5 in June. 7R is a remake of a very popular game, 16 isn't. Maybe expecting 16 to outdo 7R sales had unrealistic expectations. And Jacob said, it's possible. As a former Wall Street analyst myself, I can tell you most of the time they don't know what they're talking about. That much is pretty clear. Especially when it comes to something like video games, I can imagine. He replied to another comment saying, you're not accounting for the amount of money and support from Sony that Square Enix would lose if they dropped the exclusivity. We learned that Final Fantasy XVI's production benefited greatly from Sony's development team. I even saw a quote that FF16 would still be in development if not for Sony. He then said, I am absolutely counting for the amount of funding and support from Sony that SE loses. Receiving X millions of dollars in covered costs while potentially losing X million in greater sales from more platforms, promoting is a poor trade-off. I think that's an interesting idea, right? Would you rather have that exact same money in sales, or would you rather have it directly in a check from a publisher? I think for a lot of businesses, like Square, they're thinking they'd rather have Sony's check because it is very low risk. You're guaranteed to get that money. And so of course the low risk option is always going to be more appealing. But honestly, it makes you wonder for something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, when you have an ongoing series like that and you want to get people invested into the next one, I would think that you would want pretty much everyone who can buy that to buy it, because the more people buy it, the more word of mouth gets out, etc. And then that widens your reach, right? And of course, as someone pointed out, that doesn't seem to hurt God of War Ragnarok or Spider-Man or Tears of the Kingdom. However, Jacob responds, all three are first-party titles. In the case of Final Fantasy XVI, you have a lot of great PlayStation content that Sony needs to promote, including its first party. The success of Final Fantasy XVI probably isn't going to be as important to them as the success of the next Spider-Man. It's very clear here that Kiryu, the new CEO, is headed toward a multi-platform future, and that means putting titles on Xbox. And so it wouldn't surprise me that if we see some of the currently Sony exclusive games come to Xbox, if that is his push forward. But even more than that, I think that this means that we're going to see Final Fantasy XVII make a return to Xbox. I don't think that the next game will have the PlayStation exclusivity that we're currently seeing right now with 16 and 7R. And even then, a lot of that PlayStation exclusivity is not quite as long as it was before. Final Fantasy VII Remake, Sony had that title locked up for like 18 plus months. With Final Fantasy XVI, the console exclusivity deal was only 6 months. And then with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, according to the new trailers, it is only a 3-month exclusivity deal. So it seems like they are dialing back on how much they do it. It's entirely possible that what's going to happen is that they may do smaller exclusivity windows with Sony so that Sony can still pay for stuff and they could still get some money for Sony and then have promotion on Xbox. But again, it really looks like from what Jacob is saying here, who has this insider knowledge on the operations of what's happening in Square, that they are kind of done with the console exclusivity thing, it seems like. That's the only thing here that I really strongly disagree with enough, was just saying that, like, hey, when he kind of made the point that pushing out a lot of IP is kind of like Square Enix just being bold and stuff. And I don't think that was really the problem, kind of the issue that they had when it came to titles like, for Forspoken or Babylon's Fall. It's that a lot of these games were very, very, very expensive to make. And a lot of these titles weren't daring, weren't the quality that they were supposed to be. Certainly didn't represent the amount of budget that was put into them. And while I don't think that affects the sales of something like Final Fantasy XVI, that much I do agree with, it does kind of affect the brand of Square Enix. And whenever I do see a new IP from Square, I am a little hesitant, right? Because I don't know necessarily if it's going to be the same level of quality as, something like a Final Fantasy VII Remake, or if it's going to be, another Forspoken. So I do think that there is an image problem there with their brand with regards to if there is enough trust to buy the next thing based on having bought the previous thing. I do think that is a problem, and I do think that they would have benefited from putting out less IPs than they did these previous few years and making sure that those IPs are airtight quality games that can at least do a 70 on Metacritic. I don't think that's impossible to ask for. And I think if they would have done that, they would have saw a lot more reception for these titles that was leaning positive than just the absolute negative lambasting of these titles, especially in cases like Avengers and Babylon's Fall, where the amount of greed that was happening with the microtransactions and things like that was so ridiculous that so many people went and called them out. And I say good, right? Because those games were atrocious, both to play and considering their monetization. So please let me know in the comments below what you think about this assessment, coming from someone who has worked directly inside of Square Enix, reporting to the CEOs. I really want to hear you guys' thoughts on what he makes from someone with that perspective. And I'll see you all in the next video.